The emergency room at San Antonio Military Medical Center buzzed with controlled chaos as another ambulance pulled into the bay. Dr. Marcus Chun, a Navy SEAL turned trauma surgeon, barely looked up from the chest X-ray he was examining when the paramedics wheeled in their latest patient. After 15 years of treating everything from training accidents to combat injuries, he had learned to prioritize based on the urgency in the paramedic's voice rather than the drama of the moment. Female, approximately 28, motorcycle versus semi-truck. The lead paramedic called out as they rushed through the automatic doors. Vitals are stable, but she's got multiple fractures and possible internal injuries. She's been conscious, but hasn't said a word since we found her. Marcus glanced over and immediately noticed something that made him pause. The woman on the gurney lay perfectly still, her eyes open and alert, but there was something in her posture that struck him as unusual. Despite what had to be excruciating pain from obvious injuries, she maintained a rigid control over her body that reminded him of something he couldn't quite place. "Trauma Bay 3, he directed, following the gurney as they moved deeper into the emergency department. "What's her name?" "No identification found at the scene." "She's not talking, document. Not even to tell us if anything hurts." Marcus frowned as they transferred the woman to the examination table. Her silence wasn't the dazed quiet of someone in shock or the unconscious state of severe head trauma. Her eyes were sharp, constantly scanning the room, taking in every detail with an awareness that seemed almost tactical. She tracked the movement of each medical professional, noted the location of every piece of equipment, and her breathing remained controlled despite what had to be significant pain. "Ma'am, I'm Dr. Chun," he said, moving closer to the table. "Can you tell me your name?" She looked directly at him, but said nothing. Her gaze was steady, evaluating, and Marcus felt an odd sensation of being assessed rather than simply looked at. There was intelligence in those eyes, along with something else he recognized, but couldn't immediately identify. The initial examination revealed the extent of her injuries. A compound fracture of her right leg, several broken ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and extensive road rash covered much of her left side. Any one of these injuries should have had her crying out in pain, yet she endured the examination with only the slightest tightening around her eyes when he touched the most damaged areas. "I need to reset your shoulder," Marcus explained, preparing for what he knew would be an extremely painful procedure. "This is going to hurt significantly. Would you like something for the pain first?" She shook her head once, a sharp, definitive movement. Marcus exchanged glances with Sarah, the head nurse. In his years of practice, he had seen tough patients before, but this level of pain tolerance was extraordinary. More concerning was the way she seemed to be evaluating every person who entered the room, memorizing faces and positions with the systematic attention of someone trained in surveillance. As he began the procedure to reset her shoulder, Marcus watched her face carefully. The pain had to be enormous, but she controlled her breathing in a specific pattern he recognized. It was a technique taught in military survival training, a method of managing pain through controlled breathing and mental discipline. He had learned it himself during SEAL training and had seen it used by special operations personnel when medical care wasn't immediately available. The shoulder reset with a sharp pop that echoed through the trauma bay. Most patients would have screamed or at least groaned, but she simply closed her eyes for a moment, her breathing never wavering from its controlled pattern. "That's interesting technique," Marcus said quietly, securing her arm in a sling. "Where did you learn that breathing method?" For the first time, he saw something change in her expression. It was subtle, just a slight narrowing of her eyes, but it told him his instinct had been correct. This woman had military training and probably more extensive training than most. "We need to get you to surgery for that leg," he continued, making notes on her chart. "The fracture is severe enough that it requires immediate attention. I'm also concerned about possible internal injuries from the impact." She nodded once, acknowledging his words, but still offering no verbal response. As the surgical team prepared her for the operating room, Marcus found himself increasingly puzzled by his patient. Her silence wasn't defiant or scared. It was strategic. She was choosing not to speak, and that choice seemed to come from training rather than trauma. During the 3-hour surgery to repair her leg, Marcus had time to think about the anomalies he had observed. The way she had automatically checked exit routes when brought into the trauma bay. The systematic manner in which she had cataloged every person in the room. The pain management techniques that few civilians would know. The controlled breathing pattern that suggested intensive training in handling extreme stress. Most telling of all was a small detail he had noticed during the initial examination. Despite the severity of the motorcycle accident, her injuries showed defensive patterns. The road rash was concentrated on her left side, suggesting she had managed to control her fall to some degree. The way her leg was broken indicated she had attempted to protect her head and torso during the impact. These weren't the random injuries of someone who had simply lost control of their motorcycle. They were the calculated damages of someone who had managed a catastrophic situation with trained precision. When the surgery was complete and she was moved to recovery, Marcus checked on her progress. She was awake within an hour, unusual for someone who had undergone such extensive surgery. Most patients required several hours to fully emerge from anesthesia, but her eyes opened alert and focused, immediately scanning the new environment. Surgery went well, Marcus told her, checking her vital signs. We had to insert a rod and several pins to stabilize the fracture, but you should have full mobility once you heal. The internal injuries were less severe than we initially thought. She nodded, acknowledging his report, but continuing her silence. I'm curious about something, Marcus said, pulling up a chair beside her bed. In my experience, people who don't talk in hospitals usually have a reason that goes beyond being unable to speak. You understand everything being said to you. You respond appropriately to instructions, but you're choosing not to communicate verbally. That suggests either a very specific type of trauma or very specific training. He paused, watching her reaction carefully. I spent 12 years as a Navy SEAL before going to medical school. I worked with people from various special operations backgrounds, and I recognize certain patterns of behavior. Your pain tolerance, your awareness of your surroundings, your controlled responses to stress. These aren't typical civilian reactions. For the first time since her arrival, Marcus saw genuine surprise flicker across her face. It was quickly controlled, but for just a moment, her carefully maintained composure had cracked. I'm not trying to compromise your operational security or force you to break any protocols, he continued. But, as your doctor, I need to understand if there are any medical considerations related to your background that I should be aware of. Some types of training or deployment can affect how we approach your treatment and recovery. She studied him for a long moment, and Marcus could almost see her weighing decisions behind those intelligent eyes. Finally, she spoke for the first time since arriving at the hospital. How long have you been out? Her voice was rough from hours of silence, but clear and controlled. 8 years, Marcus replied. I finished my residency at Walter Reed, then came here to work with active duty and veteran populations. Teams 6, mostly Middle East deployments. She nodded slowly, and some of the tension in her posture seemed to ease. Marines, Force Recon. 3 deployments, Afghanistan and Iraq. The simple exchange told Marcus more than a lengthy conversation might have. She had identified herself as Marine Force Reconnaissance, one of the most elite units in the military. Her careful evaluation of him before speaking, her decision to remain silent until she could verify his credentials, and her minimal disclosure, even then, all spoke to someone with significant experience in sensitive operations. Recent discharge? He asked. 18 months. How's the transition going? She was quiet for a moment before responding. It was going fine until this morning. Marcus understood the weight behind those words. Transitioning from military service to civilian life was challenging for anyone, but for special operations personnel, the adjustment could be particularly difficult. The structure, purpose, and brotherhood of elite military units was hard to replace, and many veterans struggled to find their place in civilian society. "What happened this morning?" he asked gently. "I was writing to a job interview. Downtown law firm, security consultant position. Someone ran a red light, and I had to choose between hitting them or the semi-truck." She paused, looking down at her injured leg. "I chose the semi. That was probably the right choice. A motorcycle versus passenger car collision can be just as fatal, and you might have injured innocent people." "I know, but now I'm stuck in a hospital instead of starting a new job, and I don't have insurance to cover this." Marcus understood another piece of the puzzle. Like many veterans, she was probably struggling financially during her transition to civilian life. The medical bills from her injuries would be substantial, adding financial stress to her physical recovery and the already challenging process of adapting to life outside the military. "What's your name?" he asked. "Jessica Torres." "Well, Jessica, there are some things we can do about the financial situation. This hospital has programs for veterans, and since your injuries are from a traffic accident, there might be insurance coverage through the other driver. But right now, your focus needs to be on healing." Jessica shifted in the bed, testing the limits of movement with her various injuries. "How long until I can walk normally?" "With physical therapy and, assuming no complications, probably 3 to 4 months for normal mobility. 6 months before you're back to your previous level of physical capability." Marcus saw her jaw tighten at this news. For someone accustomed to peak physical condition and the demands of special operations, being laid up for months would be particularly difficult. "I can't be out of work for 6 months, she said. "I've been living on savings since I got out, and they're almost gone." "Let's take this one step at a time," Marcus replied. "First, we focus on getting you stable and beginning the healing process. Then, we work on the other challenges. You didn't survive force recon training and 3 combat deployments to be defeated by a recovery period." For the first time since arriving at the hospital, Jessica almost smiled. It was a brief expression, quickly controlled, but it suggested that beneath the rigid discipline and careful silence, there was still hope. "Dr. Chun," she said as he prepared to leave, "thank you for understanding why I couldn't talk earlier. In our line of work, operational security becomes instinct. It's hard to turn off, even when you're the one who needs help." As Marcus left Jessica's room, he found himself thinking about the complexities of treating veteran patients, particularly those from elite units. Their training made them exceptionally resilient in some ways, but it could also create barriers to accepting help and adapting to civilian life. Jessica Torres was clearly a formidable individual, but even the strongest people could find themselves overwhelmed by the combination of physical injury, financial pressure, and the ongoing challenges of transitioning from military to civilian life. He made a note to follow her case closely. Something told him that Jessica's story was more complicated than a simple motorcycle accident, and that the silence she had maintained upon arrival was about more than just operational security. In his experience, when elite warriors chose not to speak, it was usually because they were protecting something or someone, and he suspected that Jessica Torres had secrets that went deeper than her military service record. 3 days after the surgery, Jessica Torres had become the most talked-about patient on the trauma ward, not because she was difficult or demanding, but because of her extraordinary behavior during recovery. While other patients complained about pain, called for nurses, or struggled with the discomfort of being bedridden, Jessica maintained the same controlled silence and alertness she had displayed since arrival. Marcus observed her during his morning rounds, noting details that continued to intrigue him. She had somehow managed to position herself in the bed so she could see both the door and the window. Her water pitcher, call button, and personal items were arranged with military precision. Most tellingly, she tracked the movement of every person who entered her room with the same systematic attention he had noticed on her first day. "How are you feeling today?" Marcus asked, checking her chart on his tablet. "Better," Jessica replied. It was still a minimal response, but she was speaking more than she had initially. "Your surgical site is healing well, and the swelling in your ribs is going down. Physical therapy wants to start some basic exercises today, if you're up for it. I'm ready. Marcus had expected this response. In his experience, special operations veterans were often the most motivated patients when it came to physical recovery. Their training had conditioned them to push through discomfort and work toward operational readiness, even when that operation was simply returning to normal life. "There is something I wanted to discuss with you," Marcus said, pulling up a chair. "I've been reviewing your case, and there are some inconsistencies I'd like to understand better." Jessica's expression became more guarded, and Marcus could see her mental defenses activating. "The police report from your accident mentions that you were riding a motorcycle registered to someone named David Torres. Is that a relative?" "My brother," Jessica replied after a brief hesitation. "The registration address is listed as an apartment complex about 30 miles from where the accident occurred, but the paramedics found you much closer to downtown. Can you help me understand your route that morning?" Jessica was quiet for nearly a full minute before responding. "I was taking a longer route to calm my nerves before the job interview." Marcus nodded, but he could tell there was more to the story. "The paramedics also mentioned that when they found you, you were conscious and had somehow managed to move away from the motorcycle before they arrived. That's unusual for someone with your injuries. Training takes over sometimes, even with a compound fracture and broken ribs. Especially then." Marcus leaned forward slightly. "Jessica, I'm not asking these questions to put you in any kind of difficult position. But, as your doctor, I need to understand the full picture. If there's something about the circumstances of your accident that affects your medical care or recovery, I need to know." She studied his face carefully, and Marcus could see her evaluating how much to trust him. Finally, she seemed to reach a decision. "Dr. Chun, what do you know about veterans who work in high-risk security after their discharge?" The question surprised Marcus, but it also provided a crucial piece of information. "You mean private security contractors? Executive protection? That sort of work. Something like that. I know it can be dangerous work, and that companies sometimes hire former special operations personnel for situations where civilian security isn't sufficient." Jessica nodded slowly. "The job interview I was going to wasn't exactly for a traditional security consultant position." Marcus waited, sensing that pushing for more information would cause her to retreat back into silence. "There are companies that handle very specific types of security problems," Jessica continued. "Missing persons cases where law enforcement has limitations. Corporate situations where executives need protection from sophisticated threats. Sometimes former military personnel are hired for these situations because they have skills that civilian security companies don't." "Are you saying the accident happened while you were working, not going to an interview?" "I'm saying the situation is more complicated than what's in the police report." Before Marcus could respond, there was a knock on the door. A man in a dark suit entered, showing a badge to Marcus. "Dr. Chun, I'm Agent Harrison with the FBI. I need to speak with Ms. Torres about the circumstances surrounding her accident." Marcus felt Jessica tense beside him, and he noticed her hand move slightly closer to the call button, though not in a way that suggested she planned to use it. Instead, it seemed like an automatic tactical positioning. "I'm sorry, Agent Harrison, but Ms. Torres is still recovering from major surgery. Unless this is a matter of immediate urgency, I'd prefer to limit stressful interactions until she's more stable." "I'm afraid this can't wait, Doctor. There are some questions about Ms. Torres's activities that need to be addressed." Jessica spoke for the first time since the agent entered. "Dr. Chun, it's all right. I can talk to Agent Harrison." Marcus reluctantly stepped back, but remained in the room. "I'll stay as her physician to monitor her condition during any questioning." Agent Harrison opened a small notebook. "Ms. Torres, can you tell me about your relationship with David Torres?" "He's my brother." "When did you last see him?" "About 2 weeks ago." "What was the nature of that meeting?" Jessica hesitated. "We had dinner. Talked about family things." "Ms. Torres, we have reason to believe your brother has been involved in activities that may violate federal law. Specifically, we think he may be connected to a network that provides unauthorized security services to individuals and organizations engaged in illegal activities." Marcus saw Jessica's expression become completely neutral, a mask of controlled indifference that he recognized from his own military training. It was the look of someone who had been taught to reveal nothing under interrogation. "I don't know anything about my brother's work activities," Jessica said, "but you were riding his motorcycle on the day of your accident. I borrowed it for transportation to go to a job interview at a law firm that, when we called, said they had no record of any interview scheduled with you that day." Marcus watched the exchange with growing concern. It was becoming clear that Jessica's accident had occurred under circumstances far more complicated than she had initially indicated. "Agent Harrison," Marcus interrupted, "Ms. Torres has been under significant physical and emotional stress. If you're going to continue this questioning, I need to insist on having legal representation present." "That won't be necessary, Dr. Chun," Jessica said quietly. "Agent Harrison, I think there's been a misunderstanding about the law firm. I may have gotten the date wrong due to my injuries." The FBI agent studied her carefully. "Ms. Torres, we're not trying to implicate you in any wrongdoing, but we believe you may have information that could help us locate your brother and understand the scope of the operation he's involved in." "I don't have any information that would help you. We know that David Torres has been recruiting former special operations personnel for private security work that operates outside normal legal boundaries. We also know that several of these recruits have been involved in situations that resulted in violence and possibly deaths." Marcus felt the atmosphere in the room shift dramatically. Jessica's breathing pattern changed slightly, and he could see her processing this information with the rapid assessment skills of someone trained for crisis situations. "Are you saying my brother is involved in something that got people killed?" Jessica asked. "We're saying that the network he works for has been connected to several incidents where people died under suspicious circumstances. Security operations that went wrong, missing persons cases where the missing person ended up dead, corporate disputes that escalated to violence." "And you think I was working for this network?" "We think you may have been recruited by your brother, and that your accident occurred during an operation rather than on your way to a job interview." Jessica was quiet for a long moment. Marcus could see her struggling with a decision, weighing options with the careful calculation of someone trained to handle complex tactical situations. "Agent Harrison," she finally said, "I need you to understand something. When I left the Marines 18 months ago, I was having trouble adjusting to civilian life. David offered me work, but he wasn't specific about what kind of work. He said it was security consulting, that it would use my military skills, and that it paid well." "What kind of work did you actually do?" "Mostly surveillance. Following people, documenting their activities, reporting back to David. I was told these were background investigations for corporate clients." "But you started to suspect it was something else?" Jessica nodded slowly. "The people I was following didn't seem like typical corporate investigation targets. They were often former military themselves, or people who seemed to have connections to law enforcement or government agencies." Marcus listened to this exchange with growing alarm. It sounded like Jessica had been unwittingly involved in intelligence gathering that could have serious national security implications. "What made you suspicious?" Agent Harrison asked. "About a month ago, David asked me to surveil a man named Robert Martinez, former Army intelligence, now working as a consultant for defense contractors. I was supposed to document his daily routine, identify his contacts, and report on his activities. But something went wrong. I started noticing that Martinez was conducting counter-surveillance. He knew he was being watched, and he was taking steps to identify who was following him. That suggested he wasn't just some corporate executive being investigated for routine business reasons." Agent Harrison made notes as Jessica continued. "Last week, I told David I wanted out. The work wasn't what he had described, and I was starting to realize that some of the people I had been surveilling were ending up in dangerous situations shortly after my reports were submitted." "What did your brother say?" "He said I could finish one last assignment, and then I'd be done. He gave me an address downtown and told me to observe a meeting that was supposed to happen there that morning." "The morning of your accident?" "Yes. But when I arrived at the location, I realized it was a setup. There were too many people in position, too much coordination for a simple surveillance operation. I think David had decided I was a security risk and was setting me up to be eliminated. The room fell silent as the implications of Jessica's statement sank in. Marcus realized that her motorcycle accident might not have been an accident at all, but an escape from a potentially deadly situation. "So you fled the scene?" Agent Harrison asked. "I tried to, but someone was following me, and I think they may have caused the accident by forcing me into traffic." "Who was following you?" "I never got a clear look. But the motorcycle accident happened when a car pulled alongside me and forced me toward the semi-truck. I had to choose between hitting the car, hitting innocent people, or taking my chances with the truck." Marcus understood now why Jessica had been so silent and careful since arriving at the hospital. She hadn't just been recovering from injuries, she had been hiding from people who might want to harm her. "Ms. Torres," Agent Harrison said, "if what you're telling me is accurate, you may be in significant danger. The network your brother is involved with has a history of eliminating people who become security risks." "I know," Jessica replied quietly. "That's why I couldn't talk when I first arrived here. I needed to figure out who I could trust." Marcus looked between Jessica and the FBI agent, understanding that his patient's recovery was going to be much more complicated than treating physical injuries. She was a veteran struggling with transition to civilian life, a victim of fraud and manipulation by her own brother, a potential witness in a federal investigation, and possibly a target for elimination by dangerous criminals. "What happens now?" Jessica asked. "Now," Agent Harrison replied, "we need to get you somewhere safe and figure out how to use your information to stop this network before more people get hurt." The safe house was a modest two-story home in a quiet suburban neighborhood outside San Antonio. To anyone passing by, it looked like a typical middle-class residence with a well-maintained lawn and a small garden. But Jessica Torres immediately recognized the subtle security modifications that marked it as a federal safe house. Reinforced windows, multiple exit routes, and the carefully positioned vehicles that indicated surveillance teams. 2 weeks had passed since Agent Harrison's visit to the hospital. Jessica's physical recovery was progressing faster than expected, though she still relied on crutches and would need several more weeks before the leg could bear full weight. What had surprised her more than her physical healing was how much her psychological state had improved once she understood the full scope of what she had been involved in. "Your brother has been running this operation for nearly 2 years," Agent Harrison explained as he spread files across the dining room table. "We've identified at least 15 former special operations personnel who were recruited under similar circumstances to yours." Jessica studied the photographs and documents, recognizing several faces from brief encounters during her time working for David. "What happened to them?" 3 are dead. 5 are missing and presumed dead. 4 are in federal custody on various charges. 2 cooperated with our investigation and are in protective custody. And now you. The numbers hit Jessica hard. She had suspected that David's operation was dangerous, but seeing the casualty count laid out so starkly made her realize how close she had come to becoming another statistic. "The people they were targeting," Jessica asked, "were they all legitimate threats, or were some of them innocent?" "That's what makes this case so complex," Agent Harrison replied. "Some of the targets were genuinely involved in criminal activities or posed legitimate security threats. But others appear to have been targeted for personal, political, or financial reasons that had nothing to do with national security." Dr. Marcus Chun, who had been granted clearance to continue as Jessica's physician throughout the investigation, listened to the briefing with growing concern. In his military career, he had seen how good people could be manipulated into compromising situations, but the systematic exploitation of veterans struggling with civilian transition struck him as particularly cruel. "Jessica," Marcus said, "how did David first approach you about this work?" "He waited until I was really struggling," she admitted. "I'd been out of work for 3 months, my savings were running low, and I was having trouble adjusting to civilian life. He knew exactly when I was most vulnerable. That appears to be part of their recruitment strategy," Agent Harrison added. "They identify recently discharged special operations personnel who are having financial or adjustment difficulties, offer them work that seems legitimate but pays well, then gradually involve them in increasingly questionable activities. But why target other veterans and law enforcement personnel? Marcus asked. Because those are the people most likely to discover or interfere with the criminal activities of their clients, Harrison explained. If you're running a criminal organization, former military and law enforcement personnel represent the biggest threats to your operations. Jessica picked up one of the photographs, showing a man she remembered surveilling about 6 months earlier. What happened to him? Robert Martinez, found dead in his apartment 3 days after you submitted your surveillance report. Official cause of death was listed as suicide, but we believe he was murdered. The weight of that revelation settled over Jessica like a physical blow. She had provided information that was used to kill someone, even though she hadn't understood the consequences of her actions at the time. I helped them murder people, she said quietly. You were deceived and manipulated, Marcus corrected firmly. There's a difference between being a victim of fraud and being a criminal. But people are dead because of information I provided. People are dead because your brother and his associates are criminals who exploited your trust and patriotism, Agent Harrison said. The responsibility for those deaths lies with the people who ordered the killings, not with the person who was tricked into providing information. Over the following days, Jessica worked with federal investigators to piece together the full scope of the operation. The network that David had been part of was larger and more sophisticated than anyone had initially realized. It involved corrupt officials, criminal organizations, and rogue security contractors who operated in the gray areas between legitimate business and organized crime. The psychological impact of learning about her unwitting involvement in multiple deaths was devastating for Jessica. Despite the reassurances from Agent Harrison and Dr. Chun, she struggled with guilt and self-blame that threatened to undermine her physical recovery. I should have seen the signs earlier, she told Marcus during one of their sessions. I'm supposed to be trained to recognize threats and assess situations. Your training was designed for military environments with clear rules of engagement and identifiable enemies, Marcus replied. It didn't prepare you for being manipulated by a family member who exploited your trust and your desire to serve. But good Marines don't get played like this. Good Marines follow orders and trust their chain of command. Your brother exploited exactly those qualities that made you an effective Marine. As Jessica's cooperation with the investigation deepened, more details emerged about the scope of the criminal network. The organization had been involved in assassinations, corporate espionage, witness intimidation, and various other activities that crossed the line from private security into organized crime. Most disturbing of all was the revelation that several of the recruits had been eliminated not because they tried to leave the organization, but because they had been specifically recruited to serve as expendable assets for particularly dangerous operations. They used us, Jessica realized during one briefing session. We weren't employees. We were tools that could be discarded when they were no longer useful. That's exactly right, Agent Harrison confirmed. The people running this operation saw former military personnel as uniquely valuable because of their skills, but also uniquely expendable because they often lacked strong civilian support networks. Dr. Chun found himself playing an increasingly important role not just as Jessica's physician, but as someone who could help her process the psychological trauma of her experiences. His own military background gave him credibility when discussing the challenges of transitioning from military to civilian life, and his medical training helped him address the complex mix of physical and emotional healing she needed. The hardest part, Jessica confided to him, is that I joined the Marines to protect people. Everything I did in the service was about serving others and keeping people safe. Finding out that I was tricked into helping hurt innocent people feels like a betrayal of everything I believed about myself. Your intention to serve and protect hasn't changed, Marcus replied. What's changed is that you now understand how that intention was manipulated. The question now is how you want to use that knowledge going forward. What do you mean? You have a choice. You can focus on the guilt and self-blame, which serves no productive purpose. Or you can focus on how your cooperation with this investigation might prevent other veterans from being exploited and might bring justice for the people who were hurt. As the weeks passed, Jessica's role in the investigation became increasingly central. Her detailed knowledge of the organization's operations, combined with her ability to identify other potential recruits and targets, provided investigators with crucial intelligence for dismantling the network. The breakthrough came when Jessica remembered a conversation with David about expanding operations to other cities. She had overheard him discussing potential recruits in Seattle, Denver, and Atlanta, along with references to similar operations already running in those locations. This isn't just a local criminal organization, Agent Harrison realized as they mapped out the connections. This is a nationwide network that's systematically exploiting veterans and targeting law enforcement and intelligence personnel across multiple states. The scope of the investigation expanded rapidly as federal agencies coordinated efforts to identify and arrest network members in multiple jurisdictions. Jessica found herself working with FBI agents, military investigators, and federal prosecutors as they built cases against dozens of individuals involved in the conspiracy. Your cooperation has been essential to breaking this case, Agent Harrison told her as they prepared for the final phase of arrests. Without your willingness to come forward and provide detailed information, we never would have understood the full scope of the operation. I just want to make sure no one else gets hurt because of what I was tricked into doing, Jessica replied. As her physical recovery progressed, Jessica also found herself thinking about what came next. The investigation would eventually end, the criminals would be prosecuted, and she would need to rebuild her life with the knowledge of what she had been through. Have you thought about what you want to do after all this is over? Marcus asked during one of their sessions. I don't know if anyone would want to hire someone with my history, even if I was a victim. I think you might be surprised. Your experience, combined with your cooperation in exposing this network, demonstrates exactly the kind of integrity and courage that good organizations value. But I'll always know that I was involved in getting people killed. You'll also always know that you had the courage to come forward when you realized what was happening, even though it put your own life at risk. That's not the action of someone who lacks moral character. It's the action of someone who refuses to compromise their values, even when the cost is high. As Jessica prepared for the next phase of her recovery and the eventual transition back to civilian life, she began to understand that her experience, as traumatic as it had been, might also provide her with unique insights that could help other veterans avoid similar situations. The investigation was nearing its conclusion, but Jessica's real journey toward healing and finding her place in civilian society was just beginning. She had learned that the skills and values that made her an effective Marine were still valid, even if she had temporarily lost sight of how to apply them in civilian life. Most importantly, she had learned that asking for help and accepting support from others wasn't a sign of weakness, but a recognition that even the strongest people sometimes need assistance to navigate complex challenges. The silence that had initially protected her in the hospital had given way to a willingness to speak up and fight for justice, not just for herself, but for all the other veterans who had been exploited by people who should have been protecting them. 6 months after the motorcycle accident that had changed her life, Jessica Torres stood in front of a mirror in her small apartment, adjusting her suit jacket and mentally preparing for what would be one of the most important days of her civilian life. The physical scars from her injuries had healed well, leaving only a slight limp that was noticeable mainly when she was tired. The psychological scars had taken longer to heal, but they too had transformed from sources of pain into reminders of her resilience and growth. The federal trial of the criminal network that had exploited her and dozens of other veterans was scheduled to begin that morning, and Jessica was the prosecution's key witness. Over the past months, she had worked closely with federal prosecutors to prepare testimony that would help convict the people responsible for multiple deaths and the systematic exploitation of former military personnel. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Marcus Chun. Good luck today. Remember, You're not just testifying for yourself, but for all the veterans who deserve justice. You've got this. Marcus had become more than just her doctor during the months of investigation and recovery. He had served as a mentor, counselor, and friend who understood both her military background and the unique challenges she had faced. His support had been crucial in helping her rebuild her confidence and sense of purpose. As Jessica walked into the federal courthouse, she reflected on how much her perspective had changed since those first silent days in the hospital. The woman who had refused to speak for fear of compromising unknown security considerations had evolved into someone willing to testify publicly about corruption and betrayal, even knowing the personal risks involved. Agent Harrison met her at the courthouse entrance, accompanied by several other federal agents who would provide security throughout the trial. "How are you feeling?" Harrison asked as they walked through the security checkpoint. "Nervous, but ready," Jessica replied. "I keep thinking about all the people who were hurt by this organization. If my testimony helps prevent that from happening to others, then everything I went through will have served a purpose." The courtroom was packed with journalists, federal agents, family members of victims, and other veterans who had been recruited by the network. Jessica recognized several faces from the investigation, including 2 other former recruits who would also be testifying for the prosecution. David Torres sat at the defendant's table with his attorney, refusing to make eye contact with his sister. The man who had once been her trusted brother, who had claimed to offer her meaningful work using her military skills, now appeared as what he truly was, a criminal who had exploited family relationships and veteran vulnerabilities for profit. "Your Honor," the lead prosecutor began in her opening statement, "this case is about the systematic exploitation of American military veterans by a criminal organization that preyed upon their loyalty, their skills, and their desire to continue serving their country. The defendants recruited these veterans under false pretenses, involved them unknowingly in criminal activities, and then eliminated them when they became security risks or attempted to leave the organization." As the trial progressed over several days, Jessica listened to testimony from other veterans who had been recruited by the network. Each story was different in its details, but similar in its basic structure. Vulnerable veterans were approached by trusted individuals, offered work that seemed legitimate, gradually drawn into questionable activities, and then either eliminated or threatened when they tried to extract themselves. When Jessica's turn to testify arrived, she felt the weight of responsibility for representing not just her own experience, but the experiences of all the veterans who had been victimized by the network. "Ms. Torres," the prosecutor began, "can you tell the court about your military background?" "I served 8 years in the Marine Corps, including 3 combat deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq as part of force reconnaissance. I was discharged 18 months before the events in question with an honorable service record." "What was your situation when you were first approached by your brother about work opportunities?" "I was struggling with the transition to civilian life. I had been unemployed for several months, my savings were nearly depleted, and I was having difficulty finding work that utilized my military skills and training." "How did your brother initially describe the work he was offering?" "He said it was security consulting for corporate clients, background investigations, surveillance of people who might pose security risks, and reporting on potential threats to business operations. He emphasized that it was legitimate work that would make use of my military training." "When did you first begin to suspect that the work wasn't what your brother had described?" Jessica took a breath, remembering the gradual realization that had eventually saved her life. "I started noticing patterns in the people I was assigned to surveil. Many of them were former military or law enforcement personnel. The surveillance requirements were more intensive than typical background investigations would warrant. And I began hearing about incidents involving people I had surveilled shortly after submitting my reports." "What kind of incidents?" "Deaths that were officially ruled accidents or suicides, but which seemed suspicious given the timing and circumstances." "What did you do when you became suspicious about the true nature of the work?" "I confronted my brother and told him I wanted to leave the organization. He initially tried to reassure me that my concerns were unfounded, but eventually agreed to let me complete one final assignment before departing. Was that final assignment the surveillance operation that led to your motorcycle accident? Yes, but when I arrived at the location I was supposed to surveil, I realized it was a trap. The setup was too elaborate for a simple surveillance operation, and I recognized signs that I was being set up for elimination rather than conducting legitimate surveillance. The prosecutor walked Jessica through the details of her escape attempt and the accident that followed. With each question and answer, the systematic nature of the criminal organization became clearer for the jury. Ms. Torres, the defense attorney said during cross-examination, isn't it true that you voluntarily participated in surveillance activities for nearly a year without raising any objections? That's correct, because I believed I was conducting legitimate security work. But you were paid substantial amounts of money for this work, correct? I was paid fair wages for what I believed was legitimate work using my professional skills. And you never attempted to verify the legitimacy of your assignments through independent sources? Jessica paused, understanding the implication of the question. I trusted my brother, and I was told that the work involved sensitive corporate security matters that require discretion. I was explicitly instructed not to discuss assignments with outside parties. So you chose to remain willfully ignorant of the true nature of your work. I was deceived by someone I trusted, using methods specifically designed to exploit veteran vulnerabilities, Jessica replied firmly. When I discovered the deception, I immediately took action to extract myself and cooperate with law enforcement. The cross-examination continued for several hours, but Jessica maintained her composure and provided clear, consistent testimony about her experience. By the time she stepped down from the witness stand, she felt that she had successfully conveyed not just the facts of her case, but the broader pattern of exploitation that had affected so many other veterans. During a break in the proceedings, Marcus Chun approached her in the hallway outside the courtroom. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "It's harder than I expected to relive all of this in public," Jessica admitted, "but also liberating in a way I didn't anticipate." "What do you mean?" "For months, I carried the weight of guilt about my involvement in those surveillance operations. But testifying today, laying out exactly how the deception worked and how systematically these people exploited veteran vulnerabilities, it helps me see my experience in a different context. You were a victim, not a perpetrator. I know that intellectually, but feeling it emotionally has taken longer." The trial concluded 2 weeks later with convictions on multiple federal charges for all the defendants. David Torres was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, while other members of the organization received sentences ranging from 10 to 30 years. The judge specifically noted the systematic exploitation of veterans as an aggravating factor in sentencing. "Ms. Torres," the judge said during victim impact statements, "your courage in coming forward and testifying has not only helped bring these criminals to justice, but has also exposed a pattern of exploitation that threatens our nation's veterans. Your service to your country didn't end when you left the Marines. It continued when you chose to seek justice for yourself and other veterans who were victimized by this organization." As Jessica left the courthouse for the final time, she found herself thinking about the future rather than dwelling on the past. The investigation and trial had been emotionally draining, but they had also provided her with a sense of closure and purpose that she hadn't expected. 3 months after the trial, Jessica Torres walked into the offices of the Veterans Justice Project, a nonprofit organization that provided legal assistance to veterans who had been victims of exploitation or fraud. She was starting work as a victim advocate, using her experience and knowledge to help other veterans navigate the complex process of seeking justice and rebuilding their lives. "What made you decide to work with us?" asked Sarah Martinez, the organization's director, during Jessica's first day orientation. "I realized that my experience, as difficult as it was, gave me insights that could help other veterans avoid similar situations or recover from them," Jessica replied. I spent 8 years serving my country in the military, and I want to continue serving veterans who need assistance. The work was challenging but rewarding. Jessica found herself helping veterans who had been victims of various forms of exploitation: fraudulent education programs, predatory lending, employment scams, and even other criminal organizations similar to the one that had victimized her. Her first major case involved a former Army Ranger who had been recruited by a security company for overseas work that turned out to be illegal arms trafficking. Like Jessica, he had been gradually drawn into criminal activity without understanding the true nature of his assignments. Unlike Jessica, he had been arrested and charged as a co-conspirator before anyone realized he had been victimized. The prosecutors see him as a criminal, Sarah explained as she briefed Jessica on the case. But based on what you've told us about your experience, this sounds like the same pattern of exploitation. Jessica reviewed the case file, recognizing familiar elements from her own experience. He was recruited during a vulnerable period, promised legitimate work, gradually involved in questionable activities, and then abandoned when the operation was exposed. It's exactly the same pattern. Working on cases like this gave Jessica a sense of purpose that had been missing since her discharge from the Marines. She was using her military skills and experience, but in service of protecting and advocating for veterans rather than for the profit of criminals. Dr. Marcus Chun remained a close friend and informal advisor as Jessica built her new career. During one of their regular coffee meetings, he reflected on how much she had changed since those first silent days in the hospital. "Do you ever think about how different your life might have been if the accident hadn't happened?" he asked. "Sometimes," Jessica replied, "but I've come to believe that everything happens for a reason. If I hadn't been injured and forced to stop and think about what I was really involved in, I might never have realized the true nature of David's operation. More people might have been hurt. You've turned a traumatic experience into a source of strength and purpose." "I had good help," Jessica said, looking at her friend with gratitude. Sometimes the most important part of healing is having people who believe in your ability to recover and grow. As Jessica continued her work with the Veterans Justice Project, she found herself becoming a recognized expert on the exploitation of veterans by criminal organizations. She testified before congressional committees, spoke at conferences, and worked with federal agencies to develop better protections for transitioning veterans. The woman who had once maintained silence to protect unknown operational security had become a powerful voice advocating for veteran rights and protection. Her experience had taught her that sometimes the most effective way to serve others is to share your own story of vulnerability and recovery. The room that had gone still when the SEAL medic first uncovered her combat history had been the beginning of a journey that led not to the end of her service, but to a new form of service that honored both her military past and her civilian future. Jessica Torres had learned that healing from trauma wasn't just about recovering what was lost, but about discovering new strengths and purposes that trauma could not take away.